The first time the delivery driver walked into the CEO's mansion, the air itself seemed to hold its breath, as if it already knew something no one else did. For 20 years, Armaan Qureshi had not moved a single step on his own. Not when the world's most celebrated neurologists examined him. Not when experimental therapies worth millions were flown in from across continents. Not even when hope itself had nearly abandoned the vast marble halls of his home. But on that quiet afternoon, when a tired single father with worn shoes and a food delivery bag crossed the threshold, something shifted, something no one could explain. Before we begin, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of unexpected moments, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Echoes the Stories. Your support keeps these stories alive. The mansion stood like a monument to success and sorrow combined. Tall glass windows reflected a bright afternoon sun, but inside, the light always felt dim, muted by years of silence and unspoken grief. Armaan Qureshi, once known as the youngest CEO to build a billion-dollar empire, now spent his days confined to a custom-built chair, staring at the garden he could no longer walk through. The accident had happened on a day much like this one. A speeding car, a moment of distraction, and everything changed. Doctors called it a rare neurological trauma, his brain intact, his mind sharp, but his body unresponsive. It was as if his soul was trapped inside a still frame of life. Over the years, his parents passed away, friends drifted, and even business partners slowly replaced him. His empire continued under his name, but he was no longer part of it. The house filled with staff, but none stayed long. It was hard to work in a place where hope had quietly died. That day, however, began differently, not for Armaan, but for someone else entirely. Samir Khan had been running deliveries since early morning, his phone buzzing endlessly with orders. The sun was harsh, the roads unforgiving, and his mind heavier than both. He had a 6-year-old daughter waiting at home, a pile of unpaid bills, and a landlord who had already given too many warnings. Life hadn't been kind to Samir either. His wife had passed away years ago, leaving him to raise their daughter alone. Every day was a balancing act between survival and love. He never complained. There wasn't time for that. When the order popped up for the Qureshi mansion, Samir hesitated for a second. People said strange things about that place. Some said the owner was cursed. Others said it was haunted by silence. But a delivery was a delivery, and he couldn't afford to decline. The gates opened slowly, almost reluctantly, as if testing whether he belonged there. Samir rode in cautiously, parking near the entrance. The housekeeper who answered the door looked exhausted, her eyes carrying the weight of years. She led him inside, and that was when Samir saw Armaan. The CEO sat by the window, motionless, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the garden. There was something haunting about the stillness, not peaceful, but unfinished, like a story paused at its most painful moment. Samir didn't mean to stare, but something about Armaan's eyes held him there. They weren't empty. They were full, of thoughts, of emotions, of words that had nowhere to go. As he handed over the package, something unusual happened. Samir noticed a small toy lying on the side table, a faded plastic car, the kind children often carried everywhere. Without thinking, he picked it up and smiled softly, remembering his daughter. Then, in a voice so gentle it almost blended with the silence, he spoke, not to the staff, but to Armaan. He said that his daughter had a car just like this one and refused to sleep without it, as if it kept her safe from the world. He added that kids had a way of holding on to small things because those things made them feel in control when everything else felt too big. No one expected a response. No one ever did. But Armaan's eyes shifted, just slightly. It was so subtle that anyone else might have missed it. But Samir didn't. He paused. For the first time in years, something had broken the pattern. The housekeeper noticed too, her breath catching. She had been there long enough to know that even the smallest change meant everything. Samir didn't understand what he had done, but something inside him told him not to rush away. So he stayed a little longer than necessary, speaking softly about ordinary things, his daughter's laughter, the way she insisted on eating ice cream before dinner, how she believed the moon followed her home every night. And with every word, something invisible began to stir. Armaan's fingers twitched. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of miracle people wrote headlines about. But it was real. The next day, Samir returned. Not because he had to, but because something in him wouldn't let him ignore what he had seen. He told himself it was curiosity, but deep down, it felt like responsibility. Day after day, he found reasons to come back. Sometimes with deliveries, sometimes with small stories. He never forced anything. He simply spoke, to Armaan, not at him. He treated him like a person, not a patient. Weeks passed, and the changes grew. A slight movement of the hand turned into the ability to grip. A flicker in the eyes turned into focus. Doctors were called again, their skepticism slowly replaced with confusion. They ran tests, adjusted treatments, searched for explanations. But none of it made sense. The progress didn't follow medical logic. It followed connection. Samir never claimed to understand it. He only knew that when he spoke, Armaan listened, not just with his mind, but with something deeper, something that had been asleep for 20 years. One afternoon, Samir brought his daughter along. She was shy at first, holding tightly onto his hand. But when she saw Armaan, she didn't see a broken man. She saw someone who looked lonely. She walked up to him and placed her small toy car in his lap, the same kind he had noticed on the first day. The room fell silent. And then, slowly, painfully, as if lifting the weight of 2 decades, Armaan's hand moved. He held the car. Tears filled the room before anyone realized what was happening. The impossible was unfolding, not in a dramatic explosion of miracles, but in quiet, human moments, built on patience, kindness, and something science couldn't measure. Months later, Armaan stood. Not fully steady, not without struggle, but he stood. The man who had been trapped in stillness for 20 years took his first step, supported not just by therapy, but by something far more powerful. Hope. And it hadn't come from wealth, or fame, or advanced medicine. It had come from a tired single father who refused to see him as anything less than alive. Samir never asked for recognition. He didn't expect his life to change. But it did. Armaan made sure of that. Not with money alone, but with something more meaningful, a chance. He offered Samir a position in his company, not out of charity, but out of respect. He saw in him a strength that couldn't be taught. And for the first time in years, both men found themselves stepping into a future they had almost given up on. Before we reach the end, take a moment to comment and share, what part of this story touched your heart the most? Because sometimes, the smallest actions create the biggest changes. As the seasons changed, the mansion no longer felt heavy with silence. It echoed with laughter, sometimes from Samir's daughter, sometimes from Armaan himself. Life didn't magically become perfect. There were still struggles, still setbacks. But something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer alone. And perhaps that was the real miracle. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Echoes the Stories. Stories like these remind us that even in the darkest moments, light can find its way in. Because sometimes, healing doesn't come from those who know everything. It comes from someone who simply cares enough to stay.